Redrawing maps that determine representation in DC sounds like a neutral principle, but it's a process that quickly gets heated, and that controversy is nothing new.
It's been around as long as there have been elections.
For years now, political parties in power have drawn district lines to favor their parties. And we can expect the same thing when Texas state legislators get the census results and are tasked with redrawing the congressional map.
What the map makers will be doing, in addition to trying to achieve equally sized congressional districts, is in our state, achieve partisan purposes in order to advantage, in this case, the Republican Party, so that they will gain a larger share of the congressional seats than they might otherwise, according to the distribution of votes.
It's why these maps are filled with seemingly random shapes.
If you look at them and you're thinking, well, they should all be kind of like, somewhat contiguous and square, but then when you see one that kind of looks like a snake or something like that, you're kind of wondering, well, what's the logic behind that?
The logic is trying to align people in terms of politics. It's been going on for years, but with more demographic information at legislators' fingertips, the line drawing has become more methodical.
Historically, it was hard to design a system that would be pro-Democrat or pro-Republican. There was general understanding of it. But now with the increased data, the decision makers can draw maps that are quite clear as to whether they're going to be pro-Democrat or pro-Republican.
It's called gerrymandering.
Gerrymandering is a term that people came up with to describe when district lines are drawn in a way that somebody considers to be unfair.
Gerrymandering is likely a word you've heard before, probably in a high school government class. The term comes from 19th century Massachusetts Governor Elbridge Gerry. Gerry had a long political career. He was the signer of the Declaration of Independence and the 5th Vice President of the United States. But he is perhaps best known for signing an infamous redistricting bill. The Democratic Republicans, the party Gerry belonged to, controlled Massachusetts state legislature. Lawmakers drew the state Senate districts to benefit the party. According to the Smithsonian, until then, districts had followed county boundaries. The new Senate map was filled with odd shapes, one that was said to resemble a salamander, and it drew opposition from the Federalist Party. But Gerry signed the redistricting bill in February of 1812. A satirical cartoon featured in the Boston Gazette depicted the districts into a mystical-looking animal dubbed the gerrymander. The term stuck, but at some point people stopped pronouncing the word with a hard G. There's an argument to be made that we should all be saying gerrymandering, but that's for another episode of KSAT Explains. So what exactly does it mean to draw districts in a way that's unfair? How does gerrymandering work? We demonstrate with Tetris.
In an ideal world, I think that we would see congressional districts that attempt to represent communities of interest. And the idea there would be that regions or cities would all be represented by a voice in Congress. But instead, what we frequently see is an effort to either group certain kinds of voters together or divide them.
Those are the two main tactics of gerrymandering: grouping certain kinds of voters together, or packing constituencies, or dividing them, cracking constituencies. Take a look at this. The group of yellow and purple Tetris blocks need to be divided into 4 groups. There are some straightforward ways to divvy them up, like this, or even this, or this. But let's say the yellow party is in power, and they want to dilute the influence of the purples. They could divide the blocks this way, making sure to pack in as many purple blocks into one group as possible, dividing the remaining purples into groups with yellow majorities. Now let's compare the results of the first way of grouping with the more strategic way. And gerrymandering is as effective in theory as it is in practice. Take this prime example. This barbell-looking shape is Congressional District 35, a district that Lloyd Doggett has represented in the U.S. House since 1995. The district links downtown San Antonio with parts of Austin.
The idea there was to concentrate democratically leaning voters into that district, and they achieved it because Lloyd Doggett wins with super majorities, meaning that there are relatively few Republicans in the district, and that allowed them then to more evenly distribute Republican voters in neighboring areas in order to achieve a larger number of wins at smaller margins.
Gerrymandering has been going on in states around the country for years under both major political parties. It's a practice with real consequences.
When you have unfair redistricting, really anybody can be hurt by that. It could be that lines are drawn to disadvantage rural voters or disadvantage urban voters. Sometimes lines can be drawn to disadvantage racial minorities.
A major consequence, a lack of adequate representation in Congress.
We have a growing number of Black and Hispanic representatives from Texas, but non-Hispanic whites now make up about 41% of the population, but the vast majority of the representatives that we send to Washington.
Gerrymandering can also dilute the impact of a community. If a single city is cut up into pieces, and those pieces are combined with pieces from another community to create an entire district. Lloyd Potter is the demographer for the state of Texas. He's been part of redistricting hearings in the state Senate and says this is a complaint he's heard from more than one person.
The idea is that if you have a community that wants to have a politician that's accountable to them and looking out for their interests, and that community is then carved up through this process, they then are not, they may not be getting representation.
And when gerrymandering creates so-called safe districts, districts where one party is overwhelmingly favored in elections, it kills competition.
And there's not really any need to have a debate or discussion about the issues because it doesn't really matter in terms of the outcome of the election.
If you're in a district that's very safe, then you rely on your supporters and you take them for granted, and you can ignore everybody who you don't think is going to vote for you because you know you're going to win anyway. And that's not a good model for representation.